given us this land for our new home. So, well, you're gonna have to leave.
Hey everyone, this is Byron with Springtime of Nations, and today I'm joined by my friend, Mr. Charles Sills, and we're going to be talking about the situation currently going on in Palestine. Um, Charles, can you give us a little overview, first of all, about what's happening?
Sure. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate being able to, have this conversation. It's certainly an important one, a current one. Um, so, I think that the first thing that we need to do is resist the temptation to look at recent events without first placing them in the appropriate historical context. I'm a historian. I'm not necessarily a political scientist by trade. So I think that having this historical base laying in place, I think that's the appropriate place for us to start out. The current unrest that's happening was catalyzed by the eviction or attempted eviction of four Palestinian families in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem. These four families had lived in this neighborhood since 1957, when the Jordanian government, which at that time, controlled the West Bank, settled these families there. Their ancestors, obviously been some time ago, settled them there after these individuals had been displaced from other parts of Palestine following the Nakba in May of 1948. And so 1957, the Jordanian government settles these families in.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
So for our listeners, the Nakba, that's the Israeli victory in the 1948 war with the Arab states. Is that right?
It is, yes. It's two things. It's the declaration the day after the Israeli Declaration of Independence, and the subsequent expulsion of around 750,000 Palestinian Arabs from what became known as the territories in the Green Line, or the pre-1967 Israeli borders. And so in 1948, when this happened, you have 750,000 or so Palestinians who are expelled from Israel proper into Gaza, the West Bank, and surrounding Arab states, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan in particular. So a great deal of displacement. And from 1948 until 1967, the West Bank was controlled by Jordan, along with East Jerusalem, right? And it was during this period where these four families were settled in Sheikh Jarrah, which again is part of East Jerusalem. After the 1967 war, which was started by Israel with the bombing of the Egyptian Air Force in June of that year, Israel romped to an easy walkover, right, against Egypt and Syria and Jordan. It took back the West Bank, or I shouldn't say took back. It annexed the West Bank, or rather, it occupied it. It also occupied the Golan Heights and the Gaza Strip. In the West Bank, which had been controlled by Jordan, you still had these families that had been settled in Sheikh Jarrah, and they were allowed to live in this neighborhood all the way up until the present. And about 2 weeks ago, the Israeli Supreme Court ruled that the residents of Sheikh Jarrah were squatters, and that they were to be evicted within 30 days and replaced by European Jewish settlers, or I should say Jewish settlers of European descent.
So, if I understand correctly, the pro-Israeli narrative on this is that prior to the Jordanians gaining control of the West Bank, that this is territory that had been owned by Jews, or there were Jews living there. Can you address that? Is that true at all?
Yes. So I think, yes, it is true. And it's also true that the Israeli Supreme Court is reluctant to, with respect to Palestinian claims to ownership. Now, these Jewish families that are claiming ownership over these houses in Sheikh Jarrah are pointing to deeds that were issued during Ottoman times, before even the declaration of Israel's independence. The interesting thing is, many Palestinians have put forth similar claims, pointing to deeds of ownership that they acquired either during the Mandate or even before that, during the British Mandate, or before that, even during the Ottoman administration of Palestine. And so it's interesting that while you have, on the one hand, Jewish claims to ownership over this land through the invocation of, we have an Ottoman deed claiming that we are the legitimate and rightful owners of this territory, these houses, this neighborhood. But on the other hand, when Palestinians make similar claims, they are not acknowledged, recognized, or respected by the Israeli judiciary state. And so what you have is essentially a double standard between claims that are made on the one hand by these settlers who are pressing a legal claim to land that is currently occupied or lived in by Palestinians. On the other hand, when Palestinians make the exact same claim, pointing to deeds of ownership from pre-1948, Palestine, the Israeli government is, let's say, unwilling to acknowledge those claims.
So that would be territory within what's now Israel proper, right?
Yes.
Which a lot of Palestinians were expelled from after the or during the war in 1948. That's
correct. Yes. And aside from, so there's this issue, there's this point, the inconsistent application of Ottoman, property ownership deeds, things of that nature. And on the other hand, this is territory that was seized by force of arms during a conflict, namely the 67 war. Under the Rome Statute, it is illegal under international law to transfer or forcibly dispossess civilians from territory that is won through armed conflict. So the notion that the Israeli state would have any jurisdiction at all over any territory, anywhere in the West Bank, be it in East Jerusalem, Hebron, Ramallah, anywhere, at least under international law, is, well, let's say it's dubious at best.
Right. And even outside of, international law, I think just a norm throughout quite a lot of modern history. I mean, for example, all the territory of Alsace-Lorraine on the border of France and Germany changed hands several times, and the Franco-Prussian War and World War I, et cetera, went back and forth. But when either country would conquer it from the other, it's not like when Germany got it, all ethnically French people were forced to leave, and vice versa. So it does seem like this is kind of a not a totally unique situation in history. Obviously, this kind of ethnic cleansing does happen, but I think that might be something people need to understand, right? That this is not like a normal thing that happens in war.
No, it isn't. And, certainly the case of Jerusalem is an interesting one. It's as if you were to look at a map of Jerusalem today and how the municipal boundaries are drawn, in order to keep out Arab majority parts of the city, the Israeli government has actually constructed a network of fences and walls designed to do just that, right? To keep Jerusalem, to the extent possible, a Jewish majority city. So you've got a conscious effort to manipulate the demographics of the city itself. It would be akin to if the state of New York tried to build a wall, separating from in the Bronx from Harlem, in a sense, to keep it a certain demographic from having any claim to, let's say, accessing municipal services, protection from the police, certainly the claim to live within the city of Jerusalem itself, which is a very sensitive issue.
So can you talk a little bit about what the status is of the city of Jerusalem compared to the West Bank and Israel proper? Because I that's something that's confused me a little bit.
So West Jerusalem was part of the Israel proper behind the Green Line, which is the pre-1967 boundary between Israel and Jordan / the West Bank. 1967, Israel conquers the West Bank and annexes East Jerusalem into Israel proper. From 1967 on, Israel considered Israelis and the Israeli government have considered a unified Jerusalem to be the capital of Israel.
And to clarify for anyone listening, so it's we're talking about the West Bank and East Bank of the Jordan River, which runs through the city of Jerusalem. Is that right?
No, the Jordan River doesn't run through. I'm sorry, no, it does not run through the city of Jerusalem. The East Bank is essentially Jordan, right? It's
Okay.
Jordanian territory. The West Bank is quite literally the West Bank of the Jordan River, which functions as the boundary between Jordan and Israel.
Okay, so then why is it that there's a distinction between East and West Jerusalem?
So West Jerusalem was the part of the city that Israel controlled before 1967. East Jerusalem was the part of the city that contains the Temple Mount and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock, that was controlled by Jordan until 1967. So in 1967, Israel starts a war with Egypt, defeats Egypt and Syria, and takes the Golan Heights, the Sinai Peninsula, and all of the West Bank, which included East Jerusalem. So if you pulled up a map of the West Bank, it would look kind of like I'm pulling up a map for my own reference right now, just to kind of give a better idea. It looks almost like a heart shape, and it's kind of like in the vat, like where the two humps of that heart kind of converge. That's where Jerusalem is. So it's sort of on the fringe, quite literally the border of occupied West Bank and Israel proper.
Okay. So sorry, and I interrupted you. What were you saying?
No, nothing. I was just finishing my thought on, or kind of explaining the geography of the area.
Okay. Okay, cool. And then, so if I think one narrative that we're seeing recently in the media is that this is perhaps, or could be equated to the third of the intifadas, right? Which is a series of sort of protest and ultimately military campaigns waged by occupied Palestinians, revolts against Israel. Can you talk a little bit about how this fits in, or how this compares and contrasts to the previous two intifadas, and whether this should be called that?
Sure. So just to recap, we had an intifada that took place. There was an intifada that took place from the late 80s until the Oslo Accords. Then a second one from 2000 when Ariel Sharon, the famous mass murderer from Sabra and Shatila in South Beirut, when all those Palestinians were killed during the invasion of Lebanon. When Ariel Sharon visited the Temple Mount in 2000, this sparked a second intifada, which lasted until 2005, with the Sharm el-Sheikh agreement, which ended it. And now it looks like we are on the cusp of another intifada. There had been a few wars between Gaza and Israel in the intervening years. But this is different in several key ways. And it's also worth bearing in mind that each of the previous two intifadas led to at least some change in the status quo that existed prior to the conflict. So we can come back to what changes in the status quo we might expect after this latest round of unrest. As far as what differentiates this from previous intifadas, there are a couple of key, distinguishing factors. Number one, we're seeing large-scale unrest within Israel proper among the Arab Israeli population. I should say the citizens of Israel who are of Palestinian descent. They compose about 20% of Israel's population. We've seen since last Monday a spate of mob violence being waged against Palestinian Arabs living in Israel proper and holding Israeli citizenship. videos that have circulated all over, the internet, Twitter, social media, of raving or roving mobs of vigilantes.
And roving.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yanking people out of their vehicles and beating the Jesus out of them if they identify them as Arabs. There was actually one incident last week where a lynch mob dragged a man out of a car thinking that he was a Palestinian, beat him within an inch of his life. It turned out that he was actually Jewish, but he appeared to be Arab. So if that gives you any indication of the kind of ethnic animus that we're dealing with here, this is a fundamentally broken society here. We're seeing the social fabric of Israel itself, not the West Bank and Gaza, but Israel, being torn to pieces as a result of decades of discrimination and marginalization of Arabs within Israel. And again, not talking about the experience that Palestinians have had under the occupation in the West Bank. I'm talking exclusively now about Arab citizens of Israel revolting. The city of Lud in Israel, for example, or Lida, the Arabic name for it, is currently it's paralyzed by lawlessness. The Arab citizens of Israel have taken to the streets. They've torched police cars. They have raised the Palestinian flag all over the place, clashed with police. And at the same time, Jewish residents have kicked in Palestinian residents' houses. They've removed, kicked in their doors, yanked people out of vehicles. There have been shootings, stabbings. Palestinian businesses have been ransacked, destroyed by angry mobs. And this is supposedly, one of the examples of Israeli coexistence, right? This is what liberal Zionists would say or would have said was evidence of Israel's egalitarian, sort of pluralistic, attributes. We're able to coexist with our Arab brothers and have, a relatively peaceful, neighborly existence here. Well, apparently not, because it did not take much. It only took, decades of marginalization by the Israeli court system. We even saw yesterday the Israeli Supreme Court issued 116 arrest warrants and indictments for rioting and property damage. And all 116 of those indictments were for Arab citizens of Israel. Not one Jewish Israeli was indicted for property damage.
So how are the Israeli police responding to this situation, right? Like in the city of Lodz and other locations where we're seeing Israeli rioting against and ethnic violence against the Palestinians of Israeli citizenship?
Well, what they'll do is they'll provide protection for mobs. They'll stand around, and then I'm referencing again now this one video in which a man was dragged from his vehicle and from traffic. There were bumper to bumper traffic, and this individual was pulled out of his car and swarmed by a massive mob of Jewish Israelis with baseball bats and rebar and fists. This guy was, even though he was Jewish, they thought he was Arab. He actually wasn't, although there was an incident similar to this in which a Palestinian was nearly killed. You see the police, they stand around, they watch this stuff happen, they don't intervene. There are videos of settlers throwing rocks and bricks at groups of Palestinians, throwing them in, and the police are just kind of standing around. And you contrast that with, for example, even peaceful civil disobedience among Palestinians, I should say Arab Israelis, being met with massive arrests, excessive force, and that goes double certainly for Palestinians living in the occupied territories. But the police are complicit in Israeli settler violence and violence against Arab Israelis. And like I just said, the court system is too. You have massive property damage, massive amounts of destruction in terms of Palestinian shops that have been destroyed, burned, windows smashed, looted. And I haven't seen or heard of even a single Jewish Israeli being indicted for property damage or rioting at all since this started. So it's not just the police, although there's certainly a big part of this problem. It's the court system. It's the judiciary. And this is part of the reason why Arab Israelis have decided that this is the time to challenge the status quo.
So and that's a major difference. It sounds like from previous bouts of violence in the occupied territory. That like how are Arab Israelis reacting to this? Has there been a major shift? Are they in their recognition of the legitimacy of the state of Israel? And how does that work in terms of I don't know if you know off the top of your head any polls or anything like that, but like what is the general consensus in terms of the legitimacy of the state, and how has that changed as a result of this?
It's a good question, and I think it's too soon to tell in terms of what change over time might have happened as a result of the week's events. In terms of recognizing the legitimacy of the state, I think that amongst Arab citizens of Israel, there was a willingness to give the Israeli government a chance to engage with the political process. As an example, until last week, there was a strong possibility that the Arab Joint List, or the political parties in the Israeli Knesset that are Arab parties, might have been on the threshold of an agreement to be a part of a ruling coalition, which has never happened before, ever in the history of Israel. Not once has any Arab party ever been a part of a ruling government. This could have changed maybe 2 weeks ago. So the mere fact that Arab Israelis are participating in the political process, they're running for office in the Knesset, they're organizing into parties, would indicate, I think, that there is an acceptance of, if not the legitimacy of the state of Israel, its existence, the fact that it exists, and the only way to achieve or to further their interests as a community is to engage with it. So that if that equates to tacit recognition of its legitimacy, I don't know. You'd have to ask an Arab Israeli if that's what they thought. I think that maybe is a bit of a splitting hairs type of answer. But yeah.
So if I can talk a little bit about the present military situation, actually, if you could give an overview of that. One thing I have heard is that on the Israeli side, the IDF is considering an outright occupation of the Gaza Strip, which for anyone who doesn't know is a small territory controlled by Hamas on the border with Egypt. So do you think that might be something they would do? And what are the strategic considerations there for both sides?
So from the Israeli point of view, the strategic consideration would be, obviously, if they were to seize control of Gaza, it would be a way to put an end to the rocket attacks into Israel proper, right? This is the place that Hamas, and not just Hamas, right? You have other smaller Palestinian resistance factions that are in possession of various weaponry used to attack the Israeli regime. So the thinking is, should Israel decide to do this, it would be one way of ending the barrage of rockets coming into Israel. It's worth remembering that Israel did occupy the Gaza Strip directly until they unilaterally disengaged in 2005 under Ariel Sharon's. Actually, it was a decision that was intended to help protect Israel's Jewish majority by unilaterally leaving Gaza, right? And there were about 20 or so Israeli settlements in Gaza until 2005. The Israeli government forced these settlers to leave, and they essentially turned Gaza into an open air concentration camp, a place to put Palestinians to help preserve Israel's demographic edge, or its Jewish demographic edge. So since 2007, Hamas has been in control of Gaza. The Israelis, for their part, the IDF, I do not think that they will be launching a ground invasion of Gaza ever. I don't think that's going to happen, at least not during this conflict. Not unless Israel felt, I don't want to I don't want to say an existential threat to its existence, but I don't think that Israel would invade the Gaza Strip. I don't think they would send troops in there. They would take heavy casualties if they did. For what it's worth, voices on the Palestinian side are hoping that Israel does this. They want Israel to invade, to send ground troops into Gaza. They see it as an opportunity to kill Israeli soldiers and take Israeli prisoners, which they've been. It's difficult, obviously, for them to do that when they're hemmed into Gaza. Israel is they're very casualty averse. Their military doctrine is to flatten, the enemy with airstrikes, with ranged attacks, to destroy infrastructure, and then after the dust settles and after as many the enemy are killed as possible, then you send in the infantry, the ground forces. So I don't think Israel is going to invade or is going to send ground troops into Gaza. That's what Hamas wants them to do. They see that as a chance to really start to rack up some casualties for on the Israeli side, and the Israelis know this. They bluff. They said the day before yesterday they were going to launch a ground incursion, and they did not do it. The IDF says that it was a psyop, that what they were doing was they were trying to convince or scare Hamas members into running into their underground tunnels, and then they used tunnel busting munitions to destroy these tunnels. So I don't think that that we're going to see Israel move.
So Hamas has been preparing for that scenario for a long time, basically.
Yes, they've dug extensive networks of tunnels and bunkers under the ground. I mean, we're talking about a really small area here. I mean, this is an area that's about 140 square miles, which is smaller than the size of New York City. And in there, you've crammed over 2 million people, right? And again, just to really emphasize how densely populated this place is, right? Now, in a place like, for example, Tokyo, the biggest city in the world, right? You got a population density of around 15,000 people per square mile. Gaza has about 13,000 people per square mile. And you're talking about, unlike Tokyo, a place where running water that's drinkable is non-existent. According to Human Rights Watch, 97% of the drinking of the potable fresh water, well, it's not potable. You can't drink it. It's toxic. It's not suitable for human consumption. The electricity generation is sporadic at best. Healthcare infrastructure is non-existent. It's a pretty terrible place to be, and you can't leave, right? Because as you said, Egypt is also enforcing this blockade. It isn't just Israel. Egypt is complicit in keeping this place walled off and isolated. And so the only direction Hamas can go is down, literally to tunnel into the ground. And so you're right. They've been preparing for this eventuality, that of the IDF moving into Gaza for quite a while. Israel moving into the Gaza Strip, that would mean that the conflict has escalated significantly. If that happens, then that means that we're having a whole nother conversation about, potentially status quo altering changes in terms of the relationship between Palestinians and the Israeli regime generally. So that would be a sign of big things if that happened.
In the long term, what are the victory conditions for the Palestinian struggle? What do they hope to achieve both with this military campaign, and then ultimately how do they secure independence from Israeli control?
Well, that's a good question. We're not talking about a monolithic resistance movement here. We're talking about a resistance that is sort of the sum of a number of different parts with different interests. For example, Fatah in the West Bank has different interests even than Hamas does. I think that where the points of agreement are things that are mostly commonsensical. An end to the occupation of the West Bank, an end to the siege of Gaza, which has been ongoing since 2007, although really in practice much earlier, because as I said, Israel directly occupied Gaza until 2005. you know, the experience that Arab Israelis have had under Israeli rule with Israeli citizenship, I think has led to a shift from support for the two-state solution to many Palestinians simply want the vote. They want equal citizenship under, they would be satisfied with having citizenship under the right to vote, the same rights that any other Israeli would have. And this is obviously a non-starter for Israel because they don't want to give all the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank citizenship, because that would mean the end of Israel as a Jewish majority state. I mean, Israel's population is around 9 million right now. And as I said earlier, about 20% of that, around 2 million, are Palestinian Arabs. That's within Israel proper. You have to factor in an additional 6 million Palestinian Arabs living between the West Bank and Gaza. So if you add up all of the Palestinians living within the occupied territories, plus those Arab Israelis living within Israel itself, you're talking about parity between Jewish Israelis and the Palestinian population. So when Palestinians say we're not interested in a two-state solution anymore, what we're interested in is one man, one vote. That's a disturbing proposition. Certainly people like David Ben-Gurion and Zev Jabotinsky and others, certainly the leading lights of the Zionist movement back in the 1930s, were all consciously trying to avoid that scenario. Namely, you want to make sure that Israel's Jewish majority is protected at all costs. So this is kind of an irreconcilable demand, right? It's irreconcilable with the foundational credo of the Zionist ideology. We must promote and protect Jewish majority in Israel. So it's difficult to say, where this ends. These are diametrically opposed, demands, you could say, because Israel obviously has made sure that a two-state solution is non-viable at this point. I mean, again, all you have to do is look at a map of Israeli settlement construction in the West Bank. There is no viable two-state solution, right? The Palestinians aren't asking for a two-state solution on the street anymore. The Palestinian street recognizes that this farce of a state would be nothing more than a landlocked Bantustan. It wouldn't be, to use the South African sort of precedent as an example.
Sorry, we lost our connection for a minute there, but now we're back. So before we cut out, I was just we were talking about a lot of Israelis, and I think this is you could relate this situation to something like as you brought up South Africa or even Rhodesia, where the settler minority that was ruling these places was very concerned about essentially what would happen to them if they were to ever loosen up, ever give up power. And I think that is very much something that's on the mind of Jewish citizens of Israel in terms of the Palestinian conflict. So one thing that I think is interesting, and I don't know, obviously you can't necessarily speak for the Palestinians, right? But what do you think are the views about what would happen to basically all of the Jewish citizens of Israel if there were to be a one-state solution, or a Palestinian victory really of any kind?
So I haven't seen any indication, at least from any credible voices on the Palestinian side of the equation, that have demanded, that all citizens of Israel who are Jewish leave. I think that at this point you have a population that simply wants to have access to the same opportunities and resources, legal and otherwise, that Israelis have right now. I think that if for no other reason, they recognize that it is not politically wise to come out and say, when we win, we're going to do to you what you've been doing to us, frankly, for the past 73 years, right? The most pragmatic political platform is to emphasize, not a hatred of Israeli Jews as such, but rather, if and when we are able to overthrow the occupation regime, anyone who's willing to live alongside Palestinian Arabs is more than welcome to do so. This is not a place where, I think that the difference between an interesting difference between the Rhodesian case or even the South African one and what's happening in Palestine is you actually do have rough parity between the Jewish population and the Palestinians. Fundamentally changing that would mean massive displacement or worse, violence against one or the other community. Whereas in Rhodesia, you're always dealing with a very small white minority population, that was subservient, that was supported the Ian Smith government. But really, there was never going to be demographic parity in Zimbabwe and Rhodesia, right, between the supporters of Ian Smith's government and the Robert Mugabe, Joseph Nkomo resistance movement. Same thing in South Africa, So I don't think that the Israeli Jews are as vulnerable to that kind of eventuality as white communities in South Africa and Rhodesia were. Although it's interesting that you bring up the Rhodesian case, I think that is the Rhodesian Bush War is kind of a template for what the Palestinian cause is now going to evolve to into. It's going to resemble something a little like that, keeping Israel in a permanent state of insecurity until Israel's government is willing to make actual concessions to the Palestinians. But I don't know of any Israelis who are afraid of the possibility of a Palestinian victory. I think that the aura of invincibility among Israeli Jews is still firmly entrenched at this point in time. I don't think there's very much anxiety among Israeli Jews. I don't know. I wouldn't know that. I can't speak for them either. But I think we need to just see how things play out over the next couple of weeks.
And that's part of the goal of Hamas's program of rocket attacks, right? Is to sort of create that pressure, that psychological pressure on the Israeli government to bring them to the negotiating table. Is that correct?
Right. It's mostly the psychological impact because Israelis are not used to living under, persistent threats to their security. They're like, they're not accustomed to, their first world lifestyle being disrupted every 5 minutes by sirens blaring and rockets sometimes falling, sometimes being intercepted by the Iron Dome. The whole point is to make this as costly economically. You want to try to ruin their economy by keeping the whole place on a knife's edge, as unstable as possible for as long as possible. You want to deter future would-be settlers from coming in the first place by projecting this image of Israel as a war-torn, unstable place. So all Hamas has to do is convince the world that Israel is unsafe, that it's unstable, that it's not a place where you would want to maybe start a business or invest in or send money to, essentially to wage a war of attrition. And it's mostly psychological. These rockets that Hamas and other groups are using, most of them get intercepted by the Iron Dome. The IDF says over 90% of them don't even hit any infrastructure, any land at all in Israel. So it is a psychological war in a sense, at least in terms of the strategy that's being used, by Hamas and the other constituent groups to attack the Israeli government.
Okay. And so we talked earlier about, comparing the Palestinian struggle to something like the Rhodesian Bush War. And I know that a big part of that was the fact that Rhodesia was surrounded by countries that were, sympathetic to and sort of supporting the rebels. So how does that relate to the situation for the Palestinians? I know that countries like Egypt have long since come to terms with Israel and are no longer really a threat. But then you still have the Assad regime in Syria, right? And that whole situation with the Golan. So really, like, how does this relate to the larger strategic situation for the state of Israel?
It's a good question. Yeah, so if we remember, right, so the Rhodesian Bush War was actually going pretty well for Ian Smith's regime up until 1974, and that's when the Salazar regime in Portugal collapsed and the Portuguese colonial project in Mozambique ended. So this was a boon for the Zimbabwe African National Union and the Patriotic Front, the Mugabe Joseph Nkomo alliance against Ian Smith. It took the demise of the Portuguese colonial regime to really tip the scales irreversibly in favor of the movement in the pro-Zimbabwe, the Robert Mugabe movement in Rhodesia. In other words, you had to have the support of at least one neighboring state, as you were suggesting, to really tighten the screws on the apartheid regime that existed in Rhodesia, right? And the same is true with Israel. This is part of the reason why one of the major points of diplomatic emphasis for the U.S. since the 70s has been to one by one cleave off various Arab states away from the so-called resistance camp. So Egypt being the first domino to fall in 1978, Jordan followed about 1994. Lebanon almost was sort of dragged into this so-called peace process, but it didn't happen. And then, of course, like you mentioned, Syria being the major sponsor, the only really major remaining state sponsor of the Palestinian resistance. Most of Hamas's inventory of M302 rockets come from Syria, right? So these rockets are the ones that are actually capable of reaching all the way to Tel Aviv from Gaza. These come from Syria for the most part. The Syrian government, along with Hezbollah in Lebanon, have been instrumental in providing weapons to Hamas and other constituent militias and groups in Gaza. Without, let's say, more, without forthcoming support, political, material, otherwise, from neighboring Arab states, it certainly makes it a steeper hill to climb for the Palestinians. Egypt is actively aiding and abetting the Israelis by keeping Gaza under siege from their side of the border. And Syria doesn't share a direct border anymore with the part of Israel where you even would have, meaningful resistance activity now that the Golan has been stolen from Syria by Israel. We're not even seeing tokenistic political support. Jordan, if it cared about the issue at all, they would withdraw diplomatic recognition of the Israeli government. They would rip up the 1994 peace treaty with Israel. We're not even seeing these steps being taken. So I think we're a long way off from seeing any meaningful support from any of the neighboring Arab states. We really haven't even seen anything from Hassan Nasrallah and Hezbollah in Lebanon. No statements of, we're going to join the fray. We're going to, allow Palestinians in southern Lebanon to move freely into the Galilee, into northern Israel. I have not seen anything at all really meaningful coming from any of the neighboring states. Political material support is short, which means the Palestinians will have to do the heavy lifting themselves for the time being. And only once they've convinced the Arab world that their cause has actually gained a sufficient amount of momentum, maybe then things will change. It doesn't help that Syria and Lebanon are dealing with quite a few internal problems at the moment. They're not really in a position to become deeply involved in what's happening. perhaps if that wasn't the case, we would see a more, assertive Arab, state-backed, kind of, sort of support for what's happening in the occupied territories and in Israel proper.
Right.
We haven't seen it so far.
And so, speaking of the internal problems faced by states like Israel and, or rather, Syria and Lebanon, and I think you alluded to also, the U.S. playing a key role in bringing different Arab states over into the camp of the so-called peace process. How do you think that the Israel has influenced American foreign policy? Because this is something that really sticks out to me is, when the question comes up is like, okay, why should like Americans care about this? I think this is like a major thing that can bring a lot of sympathy for the Palestinian people. That when we get it, everyone knows that like the Iraq War, that's widely accepted by Americans, for example, as being unjust, waste of lives, a waste of money, all of these things. But how does all of those how do all of those things relate to the Israeli agenda?
Well, first of all, this goes back to the Cold War. The U.S. And the sort of NATO Western European axis believed Israel to be a beachhead of Western influence in a predominantly pro-Soviet part of the world. Right at the time, certainly during the peak of the Cold War, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Egypt, Syria, and more recently, certainly Egypt and Syria at least, Lebanon more recently, drifted away from the U.S. sphere of influence. And Israel was seen as a counterweight to Soviet influence in the region. But it was clear that there would have to be some at least partial rapprochement between Israel and its neighbors. So you have this effort to pull Egypt out of the Soviet sphere of influence. Henry Kissinger, the famous, Jewish American who was national security advisor to Richard Nixon, he says you can't make war in the region without Egypt, but you can't make peace without Syria. Syria is still an important part of this regional, sort of diplomatic dynamic. So U.S. support for Israel goes way back. It goes back to the Cold War. The view that Israel was the most effective means of countering Soviet influence in the region, although it is worth, as a brief caveat, mentioning that the Soviet Union actually recognized Israeli independence before the U.S. did. Is one of the reasons why communists had such a hard time getting traction in Iraq and Syria. Believe me, the Baathists were eager to remind everyone which country or which ideological movement was, first to, recognize Israel. But anyway, I digress.
The early Israeli governments had a lot of communists in them as well. Is that right?
Yeah. So, you had a lot of, labor Zionists and, pro-Soviet elements that were involved that had kind of dabbled in, Marxist-Leninist literature early on, but it was never really a serious marriage between the Marxists and, the labor Zionists. People like David Ben-Gurion, for example, I mentioned him earlier, the first prime minister of Israel. He abandoned Marxism before even the 1930s, before even the first, demonstrations at the Western Wall in 1929. He was done with Marxism. But interestingly, you still had liberal Zionists were in the driver's seat in Israel all the way up until 1977. So you still had a strong tradition of, let's say, maybe superficial embrace of progressivism, progressive labor leftism in Israel up until the late 70s. Now, as far as the U.S.'s relationship with Israel, as I said, it was partially a creation of the Cold War. Obviously, it has transcended that. U.S. has given nearly $150 billion in handouts to Israel since 1971. This is something that transcends the so-called partisan divide in the U.S. The regime here has no problem forking over somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 billion a year in no strings attached subsidies for Israel. and by no strings attached, I mean this money is essentially a slush fund. It can be used for anything and everything having to do with Israel's defense, its economic development. It's pretty amazing. Per capita, there's no country in the world that has ever received as much foreign aid from another country as Israel has received from the US. So you mentioned the Iraq invasion. Most Americans now, correctly, in my opinion, recognize it as being just a disastrous, expensive, ruinous miscalculation. One might pause and reflect on the opportunity cost of $150 billion just flowing out of the country to essentially subsidize Israel's defense, its economy, its standard of living, which is by far the highest in the region.
So,
and yeah.
So when you say 150 billion, you're referring to the Iraq invasion as subsidizing Israel's defense. Can you explain that a little?
I mean U.S. aid directly to Israel.
Okay.
I mean American tax dollars leaving the country and going to Tel Aviv and going to Jaffa and going to these as I should say going out of the country and going to Israel, right? Obviously, Benjamin Netanyahu came and spoke with Congress, and he was prime minister. Interestingly, before he spent time as prime minister from 1996, I believe, until the year 2000. He's in his second stint as prime minister, and he actually gave this now infamous testimony to our, I believe it was the House Armed Forces Committee in 2001, after he was no longer prime minister. But he came to the U.S. and he said that toppling Saddam Hussein will have enormously positive reverberations for the region, kind of encouraging the U.S. to do this. I don't really know. I'm kind of lost my train of thought. The invasion of Iraq certainly was eagerly supported by Israel. The money that I was referring to.
Why do you think that was?
Well, I think that certainly Saddam had pissed off the Israelis something awful. During the Gulf War, he launched 39 Scud missiles at Israel. Right as the international coalition was preparing to push his forces out of Kuwait. Whenever an Arab state launches even so much as a single bullet in Israel's general direction, they tend to respond with overwhelming force. So when you send 40 Scud missiles into Israel, that's going to generate a negative response. During the second Intifada, the Ba'athist government in Iraq was offering $10,000 to every Palestinian family who had a son or a daughter get killed by the Israeli government, right? So Saddam was kind of trying to posture as the defender of Palestinian interests. And indeed, when the Arab League condemned Saddam's government for invading and annexing Kuwait in 1990, the only three countries that were obviously Iraq supported, and the Arab League was a vote, a green light, was a vote for yes, it's okay. But Sudan and Yemen and the PLO also were supportive of Saddam's incursion into Kuwait. So you had kind of this relationship, problematic as it was, between Ba'athist Iraq and the Palestinian Liberation Organization. So the Israelis had no love at all for Saddam. What they didn't apparently anticipate was that by removing Saddam, it opened the floodgates for Iran to gain unprecedented influence in Iraq, which had been impossible under Saddam because, of course, Saddam's regime was as fearful of Iran as it was of Israel, and having fought an 8-year-long war in the 1980s. And so I guess the Israelis didn't really consider what would happen if Saddam was removed. The Americans clearly didn't think about this either, because once he was removed, we have what we have now, and it's Iran has all this influence in Iraq that they never had before. But I guess that's a roundabout way of saying the Israeli government viewed Iraq as an enemy under Saddam and the Ba'athist regimes that came before him. what they didn't anticipate was that removing him would open the red carpet for Iran to gain all of this access. And the Iranian government is infinitely more competent than the Iraqi Ba'athist regime was. So, they traded one enemy for a newer, far more capable and more resourceful one in Iraq.
And is there now between Iran, the Assad regime in Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and sort of pro-Iranian elements in Iraq, as you mentioned, I think that a lot of people are talking about sort of an axis of resistance to Israel or a power block beginning to form. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, they call this like you said, the axis of resistance, al-mihwar al-muqawama, right? This idea that you have the connection between Iran and al-Hezbollah in Iraq, as well as these other popular mobilization units, these, what are they called? Hashid Shabi, right? These militias that are, predominantly armed and trained by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And then you mentioned the Syrian government, and then Hezbollah and sympathetic elements in Lebanon. Does it actually constitute a strategic threat to American and Israeli interests in the region? Yes, I think you can just judge by the behavior of the US in Syria, where it's currently occupying over a third of Syrian territory for the express purpose of breaking the Syrian government by destroying its economy, by preventing Iran from establishing a land bridge to the Mediterranean. I have friends in Lebanon. When I was in Beirut last year, they laughed at the resistance axis. They said it was the axis of talking, that there was never any tangible, repercussions ever, that Israel ever had to deal with, that it was all rhetoric. I don't think that anybody would deny that there is an imbalance of power between the resistance axis and pro-West, either Israel or the other Western surrogate regimes in the region, like Jordan or Egypt. But on the other hand, the U.S. is actively trying to destroy Syria with its hostile policy, with its occupation of all the territory in Syria east of the Euphrates River, with the ruinous sanctions that have been leveled at Syria since 2011. So it's difficult to say, to what extent does the resistance axis constitute a legitimate obstacle to the advancement of American or Israeli, interests in the region. The behavior of the U.S. in Syria would indicate tacitly that yes, there is some threat to these interests. I haven't seen or heard anything from the Syrian government expressing support for what's happening in Palestine at all.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I haven't. Other than the usual, we condemn the Zionist entity for its, oppression and its, ethnic cleansing and things like that. But from Syria, though, that kind of thing, politically, it costs very little for Syria to do that. And certainly if that happened, maybe if Egypt or Jordan said something like that, we'd be having a different conversation.
Okay.
But it would be a win for the Palestinians if they're able to internationalize this current conflict. If they're able to drag in Hezbollah or the Syrian government into this, that would definitely be a win, I think, for the resistance in Palestine, if they're able to internationalize it.
So we've talked for a while now. I want to start closing this up, but is there anything else that you think people really should understand about this, the current happenings on the ground in Palestine before we close out?
Yeah, so I guess one last final thought would just be the importance of the discourse that we use and are exposed to when it comes to the conflict itself. I think that there are several illegitimate grounds for disagreements or characterizations of events in Palestine. The mystification of the conflict, the idea that what animates hostilities between Jews and Arabs is biblical enmities between Arabs and Jews, or ancient hatreds between Arabs and Jews, sort of essentializing these communities to suggest that there's something unique in history that can't be compared to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or that it's a clash of civilizations, right? To use the Samuel Huntington characterization, that this mystification of the conflict really is only meant to sow confusion and function as a diversion from a quite simple explanation that's staring everyone in the face. And that is, when you have a community coming in to a neighborhood or a country and is claiming through divine right access to resources and land at the direct expense of the indigenous inhabitants, you're going to have conflict. It's not complicated. The notion that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is confusing and complicated and ununderstandable is a discursive trick used by one side of the, let's say, the conflict to obfuscate and to confuse. And just to give one last closing thought, the eminent Israeli historian Benny Morris, who is generally considered to be a reputable, or at least used to be considered a reputable voice in the sort of academic realm, he said in his book Righteous Victims, which is a textbook basically on the conflict, he said that the Palestinians' fear of territorial dispossession and displacement was to be the chief motor of Arab antagonism to Zionism. And notice what Morris didn't say. He didn't say Arabs were motivated by anti-Semitism or anti-whiteism, right? Or anti-Westernism. It was opposition to their territorial dispossession and displacement that animates Palestinian opposition to Israel. And so I think that we need to make sure that whenever we hear, oh, you have to have a PhD in history to understand, what's going on in Palestine. Actually, you don't. It's pretty straightforward. It's pretty simple. Anybody can understand it. We need to demystify the conflict and look at these fundamental issues.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. I would love to have you back to talk about other issues in the region if you'd be interested. But
yeah, definitely. Anytime. Yeah, it was fun. Anytime.
All right.
We connect again someday. Yep, hopefully soon.
All right. Well, everyone, thanks for listening. Once again, I've been Byron. With me today, Charles Sills, historian of the Middle East. Thank you so much and have a good one.
Thanks.